They don't want you to think clearly, because if you did, even for 10 seconds, you'd stop doing half the things that make you controllable. You wouldn't say yes out of fear. You wouldn't stay silent out of politeness. You wouldn't chase goals that aren't yours. You wouldn't crave approval from people who secretly want to see you fail. And more than anything, you wouldn't make decisions that betray your own advantage. That's why most people are trained to confuse movement with meaning and emotion with truth. But Machiavelli didn't live in confusion. He operated in clarity, ruthless clarity. And if you learn how to think like he did, not only will your decisions become sharper, every mistake you avoid will multiply your power. Let's start there, because the problem isn't that people don't think. It's that they think in the wrong direction. Most people think emotionally first, then justify logically after. They feel insulted and then come up with a reason to retaliate. They feel anxious and then convince themselves there's a logical threat. They feel drawn to someone and then invent virtues to rationalize it. The feeling happens first. The explanation follows. So if your emotion is miscalibrated, your logic is already doomed. This is where Machiavelli flips the entire equation. He never starts with the emotion. He starts with the outcome. What do I want? What must I protect? What must I avoid? Then, and only then, does he let emotions enter the conversation. But by then, they're not in control, they're on a leash. This gives rise to the first principle of thinking clearly. Separate the useful from the truthful. See, not everything true is useful, and not everything useful is entirely true. When you obsess over truth as some perfect absolute, you forget that decisions aren't about reality, they're about outcome. Machiavelli understood this. That's why he said it's more important to appear virtuous than to actually be so. Not because he loved deception, but because he knew perception shapes reaction. And in power games, people don't react to truth. They react to what they believe. So if you want to think clearly, stop demanding certainty. Demand clarity of consequence. Ask, if I believe this, where does it lead? That one shift makes bad ideas collapse under their own weight. But clarity isn't just about rejecting falsehood, it's about resisting overload. In today's world, thinking clearly is less about finding more information and more about protecting your mental perimeter. Most people suffer from what I call mental saturation bias. They believe more input means better decisions, so they consume endlessly. Videos, posts, articles, podcasts, opinions, outrage. And by the time they're supposed to decide, they're paralyzed, drowning in fragments of other people's thinking. Machiavelli would call this exactly what it is: intellectual dependency. You don't trust your own judgment, so you borrow everyone else's. But here's the brutal truth. Every extra voice you let into your mind makes your own whisper harder to hear. And without that internal signal, you'll chase goals you don't even value. That's why the second rule of Machiavellian clarity is filter ruthlessly, reflect selectively. Before you take in new information, ask two questions. Does this source have skin in the game? Will this information change my next action? If the answer to both is no, ignore it. Clear thinkers don't need more data. They need sharper filters. And once you have that, here's where your decision-making shifts into another dimension. You start noticing that most people confuse options with opportunities. They think because something is available, it must be valuable. It's not. The world is full of easy options designed to keep you distracted. Jobs that pay just enough to keep you from building your own thing. Relationships that comfort you just enough to stop you from growing. Distractions that numb you just enough to make clarity painful. A clear thinker doesn't chase what's available, they pursue what's aligned. Now pause, because I need you to catch something here. The most dangerous mistake a cloudy thinker makes is believing they're being open-minded when really they're just indecisive. Open-mindedness means evaluating multiple ideas. Indecisiveness means fearing commitment to any. and the world loves to reward indecisiveness in disguise. Don't judge too soon. Be flexible. Stay neutral. Machiavelli would laugh at that. He knew neutrality is often the cloak of fear. If you want to protect your power, you must make decisions before you're fully comfortable. Why? Because perfect clarity rarely comes before movement. It comes through movement. Clarity is earned by stepping forward, watching what resists, then adapting. This is why the third Machiavellian principle of decision-making is this. Clarity is iterative, not instantaneous. People who wait to be sure before acting usually get devoured by those who act, then refine. Machiavelli wasn't always right, but he was always decisive. That's what made him dangerous. Still, even the clearest mind can be tricked by a single force stronger than logic: urgency. This is where most people fall, not because their thinking is flawed, but because their timing is hijacked. When you're rushed, clarity dissolves. That's why so many power plays happen under artificial deadlines. They pressure you to act before you've thought. Sign this now. Respond immediately. Decide today. But urgency is often just manipulation in fast forward. Machiavelli understood this tactic deeply. That's why he advised princes to create urgency for others, but never submit to it themselves. So how do you stay clear when the clock is ticking? You train your delay reflex. When you feel pressure, don't ask, "What should I do?" Ask, "Who benefits if I act fast?" That single question pulls you out of the frame and places you above the game. Because if urgency is their weapon, delay becomes your shield. Now let's flip this, because clarity isn't just about what you avoid, it's also about what you create. One of Machiavelli's most underrated strategies for thinking better was the use of mental contrast. He would examine not just what an action could achieve, but also what it could cost. Most people look at the upside, the excitement, the praise, the gain. But Machiavellian clarity demands the opposite first. What's the worst this could do to me if it fails? And more importantly, could I recover? This doesn't make you paranoid. It makes you prepared. We've romanticized the idea of risk-takers. But the most dangerous minds are not gamblers. They're calculated predators. Every step they take is measured, not just for potential, but for survivability. That's why Machiavelli didn't just think about winning. He thought about what he could survive losing. That's the hidden core of clear thinking. It's not just about right choices. It's about resilient ones. And you can only make resilient choices if you're brutally honest with yourself. Not idealistic, not positive, honest. That's where most clarity collapses, because people are afraid to look at their own motives. They want their decisions to feel noble, pure, good. But Machiavelli didn't care if a decision was pure. He only cared if it was functional. He knew a decision that looks clean but leaves you powerless is not moral, it's suicidal. So if you really want to think like him, ask yourself this, before any major choice: am I doing this to feel good or to protect my power? Because often the most noble option is a trap, and the option that looks selfish is actually the one that secures your freedom. You see where this is going. Thinking clearly is not a matter of intelligence. It's a matter of loyalty to your own advantage. Every time you betray it to be liked, approved of, or admired, your clarity gets clouded, and your decisions suffer quietly. But there's a way out. A set of practices Machiavelli would have used to build internal clarity so sharp, nothing external could distort it. And that begins with protecting the architecture of your mind, not just what you think, but how you think. Because what clouds most people's clarity isn't stupidity, it's noise. Constant, invasive, dopamine-soaked noise. And that noise rewires the brain. It reshapes your priorities without you noticing. Your mind stops being a fortress. It becomes a hallway. Any idea can walk in. Any distraction can sit down. and every decision becomes a negotiation with impulses you didn't invite. Machiavelli would have called this mental vulnerability, and like any strategist, he'd never fight with a mind exposed. So how do you harden it? You start by cutting off what he'd call mental saboteurs, those tiny invisible forces that drain decision-making power before you've even entered the arena. One of the most lethal, constant context switching. Every time you go from app to app, feed to feed, input to input, you split your focus, weaken your resolve, and turn clarity into dust. And over time, this becomes permanent. You think you're multitasking, you're actually self-fragmenting. And fragmented minds don't make strong decisions, they make reactive ones. That's why the sharpest minds don't just manage time, they manage state. They protect their thinking environment like kings protect a throne room. You wouldn't make a war plan in a marketplace, right? So why do people make life decisions in the middle of notifications, noise, and emotional chaos? Machiavelli would laugh at the modern man, scrolling for clarity, tapping for purpose, wondering why his mind feels hollow. Clarity isn't found in motion, it's found in isolation. And not the sad kind, the strategic kind, because when you're alone, not lonely, but deliberately alone, you finally begin to hear your mind without interference. You become sensitive to your own values again. You remember what decisions feel like when they're made from the inside out, not imposed by trends, pressure, or imitation. This is where Machiavellian thought gains real power, the ability to manufacture mental silence when the world is screaming. But silence alone isn't enough. Once you've cleared the field, you have to build on it. And the first building block is this question: what am I optimizing for? Not what you want, not what feels good, but what you're structuring your thinking to achieve. Most people never define this. Their decisions are incoherent because their aims are undefined. One day they're chasing peace, the next day dominance, the next day love, the next day revenge. Their mind is in civil war with itself, and they call it being open to possibilities. But clarity demands hierarchy. You can't serve 10 gods. You must choose the one goal that governs all other decisions, and then ruthlessly prune away anything that dilutes it. This is how Machiavelli thought, not in endless possibilities, but in strategic constraints. He didn't ask what was ideal. He asked what was possible, given the terrain. He knew clarity doesn't come from imagining a perfect world. It comes from understanding your real one and mastering that. So ask yourself, are your decisions built on your actual position or on where you wish you were? Because here's the brutal part: most of your bad decisions aren't because of wrong analysis. They're because of wrong assumptions. You assumed you had more time, more loyalty, more leverage. And when the assumption collapsed, your clarity went with it. Machiavelli would warn, delusion is the enemy of clarity, especially self-delusion. It's easy to spot lies in others, but your mind will protect your own illusions like sacred artifacts. You'll ignore red flags, overestimate your appeal, believe your effort guarantees reward. You'll tell yourself stories to stay comfortable, and those stories will cost you. That's why one of the highest forms of clear thinking is self-disillusionment, the ability to remove the comforting story and face what's left. Because once you do, your decisions stop being hopeful. They become strategic. You're no longer reacting to how you wish the world was. You're responding to how it is. Now, here's where things get really dangerous, in a good way. When you can consistently operate with this kind of clear, grounded, disillusioned mindset, people start mistaking you for prophetic. They think you have a gift. You just get it. But you don't. You've just stripped away everything that clouds normal thinking: emotional reactivity, over-attachment, false urgency, social mimicry. And from that place, your mind becomes a weapon. Because now your thinking is no longer driven by what to do, but by what moves the game forward. You start seeing the board. You stop caring about opinions, narratives, even fairness, and start tracking only one thing: leverage. And the minute your decisions begin optimizing for leverage, clarity becomes addictive. You stop asking, is this right? And start asking, does this strengthen my position? You stop worrying about short-term discomfort and start positioning for long-term advantage. You stop negotiating with feelings and start negotiating with facts. This doesn't make you heartless. It makes you honest. You finally realize every clouded decision you've made, every bad investment, every toxic relationship, every regretful yes came from one thing: thinking with emotion instead of leverage. Machiavelli's genius was in seeing the world as it functioned, not as it was moralized. And that lens, though brutal, is the cleanest one you can look through when everything else is fog. But I want to leave you with something subtle, a tactic most miss. It's not sexy, it's not motivational, but it's devastatingly effective. It's the principle of reversal simulation. Before making any significant decision, Machiavelli would mentally reverse it. He wouldn't just ask, what happens if I do this? He'd ask, what happens if I don't? What happens if I let this situation continue? If I walk away? If I stay silent? If I forgive? Most people only analyze action, rarely inaction. But Machiavelli knew some of the most fatal consequences in life don't come from bold moves. They come from quiet indecisions, from tolerating what should have been cut off, from staying when you should have left, from waiting when you should have struck. So the next time you're stuck, don't just play out the scenario forward. Play it backwards. What happens if you do nothing? What starts to rot? What opportunity slips away? What power is quietly drained? Those answers will often speak louder than any pros and cons list ever could. And in that silence, you'll find the kind of clarity most people spend their lives avoiding. Because it doesn't feel good, it doesn't make you look good, but it makes you dangerous in the best way possible. Want to go deeper? There's one mental switch Machiavelli used that made his clarity not only sharp, but predictive. It allowed him to see what others would do before they even knew it themselves. Not because he could read minds, but because he understood one brutal principle: people are more predictable than they think. This is where clear thinking goes from personal to tactical. Once you've trained your own mind to be clean, disciplined, and unseduced by noise, you can begin to anticipate others who haven't done the same. And that gives you a massive edge in decision-making, because most people are not truly choosing, they're reacting to unseen patterns, patterns you can learn to read. Machiavelli didn't wait for enemies to act. He studied their fears, their pride, their need to look strong. And with those variables, he could reliably predict their choices, not always perfectly, but consistently enough to stay one step ahead. Now, here's where this gets practical for you. Start watching what drives people's decisions, and you'll start seeing the pattern underneath their behavior. Is it fear of looking weak? Is it the need to prove something? Is it boredom disguised as ambition? Once you spot the underlying force, their next move becomes obvious. That means before any big decision, ask not only what do I want, but also what do they fear I might do? That shift will expose vulnerabilities. Let's say you're negotiating a deal. Most people ask, what's my leverage? Machiavellian clarity asks, what threat do they subconsciously fear I could make? And you don't even have to make it. Just knowing it changes how you speak, how you position, how you frame the conversation. Because when you think from the lens of anticipated fear, you start guiding outcomes silently. This isn't manipulation for cruelty's sake, it's clarity applied in the real world. The more accurately you can predict people, the less you'll be caught off guard. That's what Machiavelli always optimized for, not control, but forecasting. And forecasting gives you emotional detachment. You stop being shocked when people betray you, lie to you, ghost you, undermine you. You expect it, not out of cynicism, but out of understanding. You see the game. And players don't cry during the game. But this level of clear thinking demands one thing most people are terrified of: intellectual loneliness. Because the sharper your mind becomes, the more alienated you might feel. You'll say things that others don't get. You'll see dynamics that no one else is tracking. You'll pause when others rush. You'll walk away when others cling. You'll make cuts others avoid. And at times, it'll feel like you're the only sane person in a room full of emotional chaos. This is the price of clarity. And if you're not willing to pay it, you'll subconsciously start sabotaging your own thinking, toning it down to stay liked, second-guessing it to stay comfortable, muting it to stay relatable. But Machiavelli would have said, better to be misunderstood with power than understood and powerless. So you must ask yourself, do I want to be clear, or do I want to be agreed with? Because those two don't often go together. And here's something that surprises most people. The clearer your thinking becomes, the more subtle your moves get. You stop needing dramatic gestures. You don't announce your plans. You don't over-explain your decisions. You don't rush to defend yourself. Why? Because your clarity gives you patience. You already know what's going to happen. You're just waiting for everyone else to catch up. That's a strange kind of power, the quiet kind. But the most dangerous thinkers are the quiet ones. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they're always calculating what not to say. This brings us to a skill very few people ever master, but Machiavelli absolutely did. Mental layering. The ability to hold multiple interpretations of a situation simultaneously without collapsing into confusion. This means you don't just look at what's happening, you look at what it looks like to others. You don't just consider your intent, you calculate how your intent will be misread. You don't just evaluate outcomes, you predict reactions to those outcomes, and then reactions to those reactions. This is the thinking style of a tactician, a strategist, a leader, and it's what allows you to navigate chaos without getting emotionally absorbed by it. For example, let's say someone criticizes you publicly. Most people react emotionally, defend, argue, spiral. But a layered thinker pauses. They don't just ask, is this true? They ask, why now? Who benefits from this being said? What signal will my reaction send? What's the second-order consequence of staying silent? And often they'll choose the move that looks weak in the short term, but builds positioning in the long term. That's the real Machiavellian edge. It's not about winning the moment, it's about owning the momentum. Now that's all easy to say, but here's what's hard. You can't think like this if your ego needs constant reassurance. If every situation threatens your identity, you won't think clearly. You'll think defensively. You'll twist logic to preserve pride. You'll ignore reality to preserve the story. So before any decision, practice this one discipline. Detach your ego from the outcome. Machiavelli didn't confuse success with self-worth. He could pivot, reverse course, change alliances, because he wasn't defending a fragile self-image. He was moving pieces on a board. That's the clarity you need, the ability to shift, adapt, admit error, not to be humble, but to stay effective. It sounds simple, but it's rare. Most people would rather lose being right than win by adjusting. That's not clarity. That's vanity. But here's the most powerful part. The more you think with clarity, the more free you become. Not just from bad choices, but from mental captivity, from overthinking, from regret, from paralysis, from approval addiction, from needing every decision to be perfect. Clear thinking doesn't mean you always choose right. It means you always know why you chose. And that, over time, compounds into power others can't touch. But there's still one Machiavellian clarity technique left, one that very few people ever use, but once you start, your thinking becomes nearly untouchable. It's called perspective reversal, and it's not what you think. Most people, when they try to put themselves in someone else's shoes, They just imagine feeling what that person feels. But Machiavellian perspective reversal isn't about empathy. It's about strategy. It's about thinking from the mindset of the person who would benefit most from your failure and using that insight to bulletproof your decisions. Ask yourself this question often. If someone wanted me to fail, what would they want me to do right now? That single thought forces your brain into a new mode. You start seeing your blind spots. You notice the convenient narratives, the emotional shortcuts, the pressure points, the setups. Say you're being offered a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You're flattered, you're tempted, but then you reverse. You think like the person who wants to manipulate you. What would they hope I believe here? That I'm special, that I need them, that I don't have time to think, that I can't say no. And suddenly the fog lifts. You see the bait. And now, instead of being emotionally captured, you're tactically observing. This is the Machiavellian gift, not just to think clearly from your own perspective, but to think clearly from the adversarial one, from the predator's view, from the puppet master's hand. Because if you can map out how someone else wants you to think, you're no longer thinking inside their plan. You're breaking out of it. And that's what real freedom is. Mental freedom. Decision-making that's self-authored, not externally engineered. But this only works if you're willing to ask brutal questions. Because clear thinking isn't gentle. It's not a therapy session. It's a spotlight on your own nonsense. And if you flinch every time it hits something uncomfortable, you'll go right back to comforting delusions. So here are a few of those brutal clarity questions. Questions Machiavelli might have asked himself before any major move. Am I doing this because it's smart or because it's easy? Am I protecting my future or protecting my image? Who benefits if I fail to act? What am I afraid to admit is already true? If someone smarter was watching me, what would they laugh at? You won't like the answers at first. That's how you know they matter. Because the path to power is paved with moments of discomfort that most people avoid. And once you've trained yourself to not avoid those moments, a strange shift happens. Your emotions stop hijacking your decisions, not because you suppress them, but because you see through them. You recognize when your anger is being baited, when your desire is being exploited, when your fear is being manufactured, and once you see the mechanism, you become immune to it. This is why Machiavelli warned rulers to study not just virtues, but vices. Not because he loved immorality, but because he understood power. If you don't understand how greed works, you'll be blindsided by it. If you don't understand how cowardice shows up, you'll call it wisdom. If you don't understand your own potential for deception, you'll never recognize when you're being lied to. Clear thinking isn't about moral superiority. It's about functional understanding. And once you start thinking this way, every conversation becomes a map. Every conflict becomes a clue. Every mistake becomes a blueprint. You're not just reacting to life anymore. You're dissecting it. But here's a trap you must avoid. Clarity without action. Thinking clearly means nothing if you don't act clearly. And that's where most so-called smart people fail. They can analyze, debate, question, critique, but they don't move. They fear imperfection. They want guarantees. They want every variable solved in advance. That's not clarity. That's paralysis in disguise. Machiavelli didn't just think clearly. He moved clearly, decisively, even when the outcome was uncertain. Because clarity isn't knowing everything, it's knowing enough to act. And when you act from clarity, even if you lose on your terms. You don't spiral. You don't collapse. You recalibrate. That's another thing about clear thinkers. They don't romanticize their own intelligence. They expect to be wrong sometimes. And they plan for it. Not because they're pessimists, but because they'd rather adjust after moving than stagnate trying to be perfect before they move. So if you've been sitting on a decision, waiting for the right moment, let this be the trigger. You don't need to be certain. You need to be clean, free from emotional noise, free from false pressure, free from borrowed opinions. Once you have that, act, and if it turns out wrong, you'll still have clarity to recover. That's what Machiavelli would have respected. Not perfection, but momentum under pressure. And if you want one final edge, something very few people talk about when it comes to thinking clearly, it's this: audit your environment. Clarity isn't just internal, it's spatial. If your environment is chaotic, filled with conflicting signals, cluttered, noisy, your brain mirrors that. If your room is full of distractions, your thoughts will be too. If your circle is full of chaotic minds, your confidence will erode every time you try to decide. Machiavelli surrounded himself with thinkers, readers, and people of consequence. Not comfort, not flattery. Challenge. Why? Because clear thought is a living thing. It grows best under friction, not softness. So look around. Who gets defensive when you speak your mind? Who pressures you to hurry? Who mocks your silence? Who benefits from your confusion? That's who you must distance yourself from. Because clarity loves altitude, it needs space, stillness, elevation. And once you give it that, you'll notice something shift. You'll stop asking for advice from people who haven't earned your respect. You'll stop fearing mistakes because your mind is sharp enough to fix them. You'll stop trying to predict everything because your internal compass is finally aligned. And slowly, without fanfare, you'll become the rarest kind of person. Someone who doesn't need to explain their choices. Because they weren't made to impress. They were made to win. But there's one final Machiavellian lens, one that turns every failure, every betrayal, every delay into a strategic asset. It's the art of strategic integration, the ability to fold chaos into clarity. Most people separate their life into two piles, the good that helps them and the bad they want to forget. But Machiavelli thought differently. He saw everything, every loss, every betrayal, every humiliation as a piece of intelligence, not something to erase, but something to absorb. Because once you process pain through a strategic lens, it becomes a teacher more honest than success ever could be. Let's break this down. You get betrayed. Most people say, "Why did this happen to me?" Machiavellian clarity asks, what signal did I ignore? What incentive did I underestimate? What blind spot did they exploit? Now, you're not just healing, you're upgrading. You're integrating new data into your framework. Your clarity becomes richer, not weaker. Or say a plan fails. Most people collapse. They blame themselves or the world. But a clear thinker maps it out. Was the timing wrong? Did I misread the leverage? Did I act from ego instead of necessity? And suddenly, failure isn't a detour. It's a refinement of your mental model. This is where clarity becomes anti-fragile. Every event, even the worst ones, sharpens it. Because here's the Machiavellian truth. Confusion grows in isolation. Clarity grows in confrontation. You don't sharpen a blade by hiding it. You sharpen it by running it against resistance. Same with thinking. If you never confront your own errors, your own contradictions, your own fears, your mind stays dull, safe, predictable, and powerless. But when you willingly revisit the moment you said yes, when you should have said no, when you remember the time you let someone back in who already showed you who they were, when you look back at that critical opportunity you hesitated on because you wanted to feel ready, that pain, when looked at cleanly, becomes clarity, because now, next time, you feel the cost before you repeat it. Not emotionally, strategically. It gets embedded into your decision-making like code, and you start operating with a kind of instinct that isn't reactive, but refined. That's what Machiavelli developed. An instinct sharpened by political exile, betrayal, surveillance, and the psychological warfare of Renaissance power plays. And it's what you can develop too, but only if you stop burying your mental losses. And here's the twist. Once you've integrated that pain, something changes in how you carry yourself. Your words become fewer, but sharper. Your pauses become longer, but heavier. Your yeses become rare. Your no becomes non-negotiable. People can feel it. They don't know exactly what's changed, but they can sense the difference between someone who knows and someone who understands. And this is where we land on a truth most thinkers avoid. Clear thinking changes your energy, because it's not just a mental shift, it's a presence shift. You walk into a room differently when your decisions are built on real clarity. You don't need to prove. You don't need to over-explain. You don't need to dominate. You already know what game you're playing, and more importantly, you know why you're playing it. And that's the final layer. See, Machiavelli wasn't just a manipulator. That's a shallow read. He wasn't obsessed with control for its own sake. He was obsessed with survival through sovereignty. He believed that a man who does not govern himself will be governed by others. And that principle runs through every Machiavellian insight. You must own your mind, or someone else will. So if you want to think clearly and decide like a strategist, you must build a mind no one else can quietly control. That means you stop chasing emotions that don't lead to action. You stop collecting advice you're too afraid to apply. You stop making decisions to protect how people see you and start making them to protect your actual advantage. You become your own filter, your own compass, your own North Star. And from that place you win even before the world notices. Because the war is always won in the mind long before it's ever won on the battlefield. So the next time you feel overwhelmed, when your thoughts spiral, when the options feel endless, when the pressure mounts, ask yourself the Machiavellian question that clears the fog every time. What move protects my position without requiring me to explain myself? That question removes 90% of noise. It won't always give you the most glamorous answer, but it will give you the cleanest one. And from that decision, everything else gets easier. Because when your mind is clear, your life stops being reactive and starts becoming a map you can actually read. And if you keep sharpening that map, keep refining your filters, keep integrating every pain point into power, you'll become the kind of thinker Machiavelli would have feared. Not loud, not emotional, not easily provoked, but dangerous. Because you don't need to speak loudly when your mind is already making moves no one sees coming. And by that point, the real shift has already happened. You no longer think to feel good. You think to see clearly. And that difference, though invisible to most, is the foundation of every powerful mind in history. Let me show you what that looks like in practice. When someone insults you, most people ask, "How do I defend myself?" But a clear thinker asks, "What do they want me to feel, and what happens if I don't feel it?" When faced with a tough decision, most people ask, "What if I choose wrong?" But a clear thinker asks, "Which option aligns with my long-term position, even if it hurts short-term?" When the world is shouting, "Pick a side," a clear thinker asks, "Who benefits from this binary, and who profits if I stay silent?" That's how Machiavellian clarity operates. It's not about always having the answer. It's about always knowing which question disables the trap. Because most traps aren't made of rope or steel, they're made of ideas, poorly framed ones, emotionally baited ones, urgent ones, popular ones. And if you don't train your mind to spot the frame before reacting to the content, you're done. You'll argue inside a lie. You'll fight battles that don't matter. You'll make decisions inside constraints someone else designed for you. That's why Machiavelli didn't trust ideas at face value. He interrogated them, turned them inside out, and most importantly, he asked who created them. That's a level of clarity most people never reach, the ability to see intellectual power dynamics. Because you'll never think clearly if you don't understand one fact. Every idea serves someone's interest. Every value, every rule, every narrative, someone wants you to believe it. The question is, do they benefit more than you do? When someone tells you to forgive quickly, who does that serve? When you're told it's selfish to put yourself first, who gains from you thinking that way? When you feel guilt for choosing your own path, who trained you to feel that guilt? Clear thinking doesn't just challenge ideas, it challenges their origin. Because once you trace an idea to its source, you realize most of your mental habits aren't yours. They were installed, and until you uninstall them, they'll keep deciding for you, even when you think you're in control. This is the Machiavellian insight that most people fear the most. The mind is programmable, and if you don't write the code, someone else already has. So take stock. Every time you say, I should, every time you feel I can't, every time you think I need to, pause and ask, whose voice is that? Because often it's not your own. It's a parent, a teacher, a culture, a trend, an influencer, a fear, an ex, a system. And until you isolate it, until you audit the voices in your head the same way you'd audit corrupt accounts, you will never think with clarity. You will just simulate thinking while executing someone else's agenda. That's the final unlock. Not just thinking sharply, not just thinking strategically, but thinking so cleanly that even your inner monologue becomes yours. Because when that happens, your mind becomes a domain, owned, operated and secured by you. And from that point forward, you can delay without panic. You can lose without breaking. You can win without boasting. You can observe without absorbing. You can walk away without noise. You can decide without chaos. You can move without explanation. That's what Machiavelli wanted for those who held power. Not to think better than others, but to think so clearly that no one could use their mind against them. And if you build that clarity, slowly, brutally, intentionally, then your next move won't just be smarter. It'll be untouchable. Because it won't come from pressure. It won't come from fear. It won't even come from logic alone. It'll come from clarity that's been earned. And clarity, once earned, becomes the one thing no one can ever steal. Not by guilt, not by force, not even by love. Because the moment your mind becomes your own, you've already won. And every decision after that is just a quiet confirmation of that fact.